Welcome back, everyone, to the second part of these talks on the Gospel according to Mark. People ask, well, who was Mark? That's quite an intriguing question, of course. Mark is not one of the apostles. The perhaps earliest tradition goes back to Papias in the 2nd century. He was bishop of Hierapolis in Asia Minor, and his views were recorded in the 4th century by Eusebius, and he said that Mark was the interpreter of Peter. Of course, the word interpreter is interesting and might mean a lot of different things. This would be backed up perhaps by 1 Peter 5:13, towards the end of the first letter of Peter, where the text says, "My son Mark sends greetings." So the idea that Mark was an assistant of Peter when Peter was preaching in Rome is very attractive. There is, of course, frequent reference to John Mark in the Acts of the Apostles, chapters 12 and 13 and 15, as a companion of Barnabas and Paul. But of course, the tendency to make all these Marks the same one perhaps should be resisted. Moving forward on the identity of Mark, of course, Mark is very much associated with Venice. It seems that in the 9th century, Venetian merchants stole the relics of Mark from Alexandria, the great tradition that Mark preached in his own right in Alexandria. And those relics were taken and housed when the Basilica of San Marco in Venice was built. A further point about that is that in 1968, so soon after the council, Pope Paul VI donated a relic of Mark to the Orthodox Coptic Pope Cyril VI to be placed in the new Coptic cathedral in Cairo. So the plundering of the Venetians was somehow redressed by Pope Paul VI in this very generous ecumenical gesture in 1968. Who knows where the remains of Mark really are? However, we just know that this gospel is according to Mark, attributed to Mark, and we're grateful to Mark as the genius who invented the gospel narrative. So we've reached chapter 8, and all of those chapters really have considered the preaching of Jesus in Galilee, with some excursions into pagan territory, for example, into the region of Tyre, where he meets the Syro-Phoenician woman who has great faith. Let's begin this part with the very significant dialogue between Jesus and the disciples at Caesarea Philippi. This is chapter 8, 27 to 33, when Jesus says, "Who do people say I am?" Which invites various comments. Some say you're John the Baptist, some Elijah, others one of the prophets. This echoes the words we had earlier from Herod Antipas and his wondering about who this Jesus really was. Then Jesus goes on to ask the disciples themselves. And as you know, at that point, Peter makes this declaration that Jesus is the Christos. You are the Messiah. Remember, the first verse of the gospel, the good news of Jesus Christos, Jesus Christ. Christ is an ambiguous term. It basically means the anointed one. And of course it's a kind of kingly thing to be anointed. But what is actually the role of the Christos? What will the Christos do? That is going to begin to emerge here in this dialogue between Jesus and Peter. Now, you will remember that in Matthew's Gospel, Jesus commends Peter. Blessed are you, Simon, son of Jonah, for saying this. And I will build my church on you, and I will give you the keys of the kingdom of heaven. Only found in Matthew. In Mark, it's much simpler, much more stark. Because Jesus goes on straight away in verse 30 to order them to say nothing about him. This proclamation that he is Christos, that he is Messiah, is to be avoided. And then from verse 31 onwards, he begins to speak about his coming suffering. He began to teach them that the Son of Man must undergo great suffering and be put to death and rise again. So, in a way, this is the essence of what it is to be a Messiah, what it is to be the Christos. Peter is outraged by this and protests. But Jesus says, "Get behind me, Satan. For you are setting your mind on divine things, not on divine things, but on human things." So Jesus rejects Peter's protests. Now, this takes us to the core of the ministry and the mission of Jesus. Jesus is the Christos who will give his life. Extraordinary, and not in the prophecies about the coming king who will bring peace and justice. Nowhere in the Hebrew scriptures will we find that he will be put to death and raised. And this issue of the crucified Christ is one that will stay with Christianity. Particularly, it will be an obstacle for the Jews. If you go to 1 Corinthians chapter 1, 23, Paul says that the crucified Christ is a scandal for the Jews and foolishness for the Gentiles. So at this point in Mark, we're reaching something which is, as I say, very much the core of Christology, the core of what Jesus' mission really is. And it's absolutely appropriate that Jesus has this conversation at the very beginning of the journey. For this is the journey to Jerusalem, the one journey. It's one because it's emphasizing this is why he came. And for the first time, Jesus has spoken about his coming cross and resurrection. As we move on and into chapter 9, we have another extraordinary narrative in the gospel tradition of the synoptics, and that is the transfiguration. Jesus going up the high mountain with Peter and James and John, and he was transformed. He was transfigured. Now, it's fascinating here to compare the three accounts. Just the fact that Mark says he was transfigured, his clothes became dazzling white. Matthew develops that, talks about the face of Jesus. And Luke uniquely focuses on the face. While he was praying, the appearance of his face changed and his clothes became dazzling white. So the presence of the face And all these things in that extraordinary account which may be alluding to Old Testament texts. The face of Moses was changed when he went to God. And then the very presence of Moses and Elijah within this vision. It's really quite extraordinary. I believe that their presence is related to the hope of afterlife, of resurrection, which is very much in these texts. Elijah, we're told in the texts of the Old Testament, was taken up to God in a chariot. Moses, we're told at the end of Deuteronomy, no one knows where his grave is. And of course there's also Enoch in Genesis chapter 5. God took him. So I think the presence of Moses and Elijah, which traditionally is understood as referring to the law and the prophets, I think their presence there is actually to do with the hope of future glory, the hope of resurrection, the afterlife hope. And Luke, in his account, has these two men talking with Jesus about the exodus, the departure of Jesus, which he was to accomplish in Jerusalem. So the text of the Transfiguration is absolutely relevant at this point when the disciples are struggling with this idea that Jesus has announced to them of his death and resurrection. There's also, of course, the voice from the cloud. In verse 7, "This is my Son, the beloved." We had the voice at the baptism. Now we have the voice at the Transfiguration. We had the voice at the beginning of the first part of the Gospel, and now we have it, you might say, at the beginning of this new part, the second part, from chapter 8 onwards. So the Transfiguration, something that is very difficult to fathom, really. As we move on, we have further conversations of Jesus about his fate. 9:30 to 32, the Son of Man is to be betrayed into the hands of human beings. They will kill him. 3 days after being killed, he will rise again. And also in chapter 10, 32 to 34, we have what is actually the final declaration of Jesus about his coming passion. So 3 passion predictions which come during this journey to Jerusalem. And every time the disciples struggle with what Jesus is saying to them. We're coming very close to the end of the journey story, and I just want to, before we enter Jerusalem with Jesus, let's just look at the story of the man, of the blind man Bartimaeus. They come to Jericho, and as he and his disciples and a large crowd were leaving Jericho, there is the blind beggar Bartimaeus. Bartimaeus is healed, and he follows Jesus along the way. And this is in Mark the final stage of the journey. But what I want to point you to just before Bartimaeus, in that third statement of Jesus about his coming passion, is arguably the key to the gospel, the key to understanding this Christology. Because when the disciples react negatively to Jesus' statements about the cross, and he speaks to them about it. Verse 45, chapter 10, the Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve, and to give his life as a ransom for many. Give his life as a ransom for many. The Greek word lutron, and we can find parallels to that statement in the letters of Paul. There is a related word in Greek, apolutrosis, which we translate commonly as redemption, ransom, redemption. It's about being freed from slavery. So Romans 3:24, the redemption which is in Christ Jesus, the apolutrosis. And in 1 Corinthians 1:30, Paul calls Jesus our wisdom, our righteousness, our holiness, and our redemption. So I think what is surprising in 10:45, and it's taken up again by Matthew, 10:45 in Mark, is we have such a powerful theological word. We tend to look at the Gospels and tracts, particularly at Mark, as well, it's the story, but there are these extremely powerful moments, just like chapter 1 verse 1, chapter 10:45. And because Mark has really very few statements from Jesus about his mission, we've got so many in John, we have them in Matthew, we have them in Luke. Here, the Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve and give his life as a ransom. They are verses that we could just take that this is really the essence of the gospel. So we have completed the journey, and in chapter 11 we actually come to the gates of Jerusalem and we enter Jerusalem. There is a repetition here of symbolic acts. The symbolic action of riding on the donkey. Zechariah chapter 9 talks of the humble Messiah riding on a donkey. And then on the second day, we have the protest of Jesus in the temple. This is something which can be used as a sort of cause for outrage. Why does Jesus do this? But it's a very powerful prophetic act to protest against the misuse of the temple. The reaction then, when the chief priests and the scribes heard it, they kept looking for a way to kill him. They were afraid of him, and the whole crowd was spellbound by his teaching. So this action has been described as the wrong act at the wrong time and in the wrong place. You know, the time is, of course, Passover. People are gathering for the Passover, and it's in the wrong place. It's in Jerusalem, in the temple, and it's the wrong thing to do. Symbolic actions of prophets tend to be similar. Now, connected to that, we have, of course, the cursing of the fig tree in chapter 11, 12 to 14, which is a symbolic action. It wasn't the season for figs, so fig trees done nothing wrong. But Jesus curses it because of the lack of response. You know, these symbols, fig tree, vine, etc., that point to the lack of response among the people. So in Mark, the tree is withered by the next day. In Matthew chapter 21, 18 and 19, we find Matthew improves on the miracle and has it wither immediately. That's rather a distraction. But these actions, the action of the protest in the temple, the cursing of the tree, the entry on the donkey, I mean, these are things which are very significant. Also, in these days of Jesus in Jerusalem before his arrest, we have the hostile questions that come from religious leaders. There's a question about his authority to do what he's done in cleansing the temple. There's the parable of the wicked tenants who don't give the fruit. See how that links back to the cursing of the fig tree. There's the question of taxes to Caesar, where they hope to trap Jesus into saying the wrong thing. And there's a question about the resurrection, which is, the Sadducees who do not believe in the resurrection are trying to belittle that belief, and Jesus has his own way of dealing with that. Finally, there's a good question. There's the question about the great commandment, which is the greatest commandment. And this actually points to, this is chapter 12, 28 to 34. The scribe who asks the question is wise. Jesus commends his wisdom and his knowledge. And after that, what Jesus says to him, you're not far from the kingdom of heaven, and after that, from the kingdom of God, and after that, no one dared to ask him any more questions. We also, before we come to chapter 13, which is another discourse, the second of the great discourses, at the end of chapter 12, we have Jesus pointing to the ostentatious behavior of the scribes. Beware of the scribes. They parade in long robes, like to be greeted, take the best seats in the best places. And then Jesus contrasts that with the widow who gives all she has. Now it's at that point that Matthew chapter 23 and Luke 20 have long diatribes against the scribes and the Pharisees, which are not present in Mark. So Mark simply has his comments about the scribes, but in Matthew we have chapter 23, a very difficult chapter, which is obviously a dangerous chapter in the sense that he's strongly criticizing the scribes and Pharisees, and that has been used in the past in caricatures of the Jews. So we have reached chapter 13. Chapter 13 is what we call the apocalypse of Mark. As we had in chapter 4, there's the gathering of different parables. Chapter 13, we have sayings about the future and sayings about the end, and climaxing with the coming of the Son of Man. This is in verse 26, as Jesus talks about the desecration of the temple, and then he talks about the coming of the Son of Man. The Son of Man text from Daniel chapter 7:13 is used here. Basically, that text talks about the triumph of the martyred people during the persecution of the 2nd century BC, Antiochus Epiphanes. And those people are represented by the one coming on the clouds, the Son of Man. Jesus interprets it as referring to himself, and he uses it here, chapter 13, and it's also used during his conversation with the high priest in 1462. So there's an awful lot in chapter 13 which unfortunately we can't spend time on. We could say that, related to this in chapter 24, then 25 of Matthew, of course, we have other material to do with the end. We have the parable of the 10 girls, the wise and the stupid. We have also the parable of the talents, and we have the description of the last judgment. So there are things which come to enhance this focus on the end in what is the final discourse in Matthew, the 5th discourse. But we finally arrived at what is the climax of the gospel, which is the passion narrative. In all 4 gospels, obviously, followed by a chapter, or in the case of John, 2 chapters of resurrection traditions. In Mark 14 and 15, there are obviously huge similarities in the stories, but also quite significant differences. And if we can go perhaps to pass by the Last Supper, we go to the Garden of Gethsemane, one of the most interesting contrasts within the synoptic tradition, and indeed with John as well. Jesus in the garden, chapter 14, 33. He was distressed and agitated. The words used by Mark are strong. Matthew tends to reduce, particularly that first word, which is in Greek ekthambasthai. Matthew replaces it with lupasthai. So rather than being distressed or almost terrified, he reduces it to being sorrowful, lupasthai. And if you look at Luke, we find that in 22, 43 to 44, we have the encounter of Jesus with the angel who comforts him. Now, bear in mind that those 2 verses are problematic. They're not found in the oldest manuscripts, Papyrus 75 and the codices, Alexandrinus and Vaticanus. So these are texts which take us back to the 2nd to 4th century. And they omit those 2 verses. So was it that the tradition of Luke built that in some way to deal with the presence of this anguished prayer of Jesus in Mark, and to some extent also in Matthew? At the end of the time in Gethsemane, the disciples flee. But before that, just let's notice the arrival of Judas. Judas comes to Jesus, 14:45, says, "Rabbi," and kissed him. Matthew, he kissed him. And Matthew elaborates that by having Jesus say, "Friend, what have you come for? Do what you've come for." But in Luke, there is no kiss. He approached Jesus to kiss him, but Jesus said, "Are you going to betray the Son of Man with a kiss?" That's a very interesting point of comparison. And then when the disciples flee, in Mark 14:50, all of them deserted him and fled. And a young man was following, wearing nothing but a linen cloth. They caught hold of him, he left the cloth and ran off naked. Now there has been the theory that, this was obviously Mark. I don't really see the logic of that. But it's the irony of the disciples who've left everything to follow Jesus, and this disciple leaving everything to get away from Jesus. Luke doesn't report the flight of the disciples. That's part of Luke's presentation of the disciples as models to be imitated. Who knows? Okay. If we then go to the trial of Jesus, we have a curious anomaly in verse 62, that when asked, "Are you the Messiah?" Jesus says, "I am." Now this is a serious problem, because elsewhere in the Gospels, whether it's being asked by the high priest or by Pilate, Jesus always says, "You say I am." At some point, though, the tradition of Mark has incorporated this "I am" as a statement of faith. It's obviously not the original stratum, it's not the original words of Jesus in the tradition. So that's a very interesting and perhaps perplexing presence in this gospel. And that's the point at which Jesus also says, "You'll see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven." So quoting once again Daniel 7:13. If we go to the denials of Peter, a very strong part of the tradition, we find that in Mark, as we would expect, it is quite basic. He cursed and swore an oath. I don't know who this man is. In Matthew, he cursed and swore an oath. But what would you expect Luke to have? Peter said. You can't have Peter cursing and swearing, which again may seem very simple, but it's another sign of the way that the evangelist actually can doctor the text in accordance with their understanding, what they want to put forward. So, after the denials of Peter, we have Jesus taken to Pilate. Of course, his response to Pilate when asked, "Are you the king of the Jews?" "You say that I am." And then we have this curious silence of Jesus, which is taken up by the other synoptic gospels, but is in great contrast with John, where Jesus has almost a philosophical discussion about his kingdom, about truth. The abuse of Jesus by the soldiers follows the purple cloak, a crown of thorns, omitted in Luke, but Luke does have the report of a visit of Herod. Herod was in Jerusalem and wanted to see Jesus, and Herod and his assistants mock Jesus. So Luke obviously reports that as something which he has found out, he has discovered as part of the tradition. When it comes to the crucifixion, Mark punctuates events with the times, the 3rd hour, the 6th hour, and the 9th hour. This is almost suggesting hours of prayer, but it seems to correspond to the reality. They brought Jesus to Golgotha. They offered him wine with myrrh. He did not take it. They crucified him. And this was the 3rd hour. The NRSV has 9 o'clock in the morning. I'm not sure about that, whether we should translate 3rd, 6th and 9th, which is what the text says and corresponds to the Roman Roman times of day, which go from 6 a.m. to 6 p.m. So the third hour is when they crucified him. Then there was darkness from the 6th to the 9th hour. Those crucified with Jesus mock him. Now this comes as the climax of a whole series of people who mock the crucified Jesus. 15:29. Those who passed by derided him, shaking their heads and saying, "You would destroy the temple and build it in 3 days. Save yourself. Come down from the cross." Then the chief priests and scribes. He saved others, he can't save himself. It's about salvation. Is he the Saviour? Can he save? And then in Mark, those who were crucified with him also taunted him. Verse 32, repeated by Matthew, and only in Luke that we have the narrative of the good thief. When Jesus dies, darkness from verse 33, from the 6th hour to the 9th hour, and at the 9th hour Jesus cries out with those words, my God, why have you forsaken me?" Found in Mark and in Matthew, but in Luke a different feel, because Luke quotes from Psalm 31, not from Psalm 22. "Father, into your hands I commend my spirit." So there's a very different development there. And we shouldn't be asking, well, what did he really say? We should be asking, what is this evangelist telling me? That while Jesus in Mark and Matthew feels anguish, the anguish of abandonment by God, Jesus also is trustful, and that's what Luke tells us. So all of the words of Jesus on the cross and all the words in John's Gospel as well, they all point to a significance of the death of Jesus. Following the death, in Matthew's Gospel, there is earthquake. The tombs were open and the resurrection of the dead happens. In Mark, it's quite simple. Only the curtain of the temple was torn, almost symbolically. And when we get to the centurion, this is where there is another significant difference between Mark and Matthew. The centurion, Roman, pagan, truly this was the Son of God. The beginning of the Gospel has said it's the Gospel of Jesus, the Christ, the Son of God. This man, a pagan, asserts he is the Son of God. That's in verse 39 of Mark. But if we go to Matthew 27:54, the centurion and those with him saw the earthquake and what took place. They were terrified and said, "This man was God's Son." Now, what is significant there is it's not the centurion alone. It's almost as if Matthew is saying, the centurion is the first, but this is the Gentile world proclaiming faith. Isn't it a bit of a coincidence that Cornelius in Acts chapter 10 is a centurion, is the first pagan to come to faith? So in quite a separate development, we have the same thing, the opening to the Gentiles, which of course will be taken up in the final verses of Matthew's Gospel. Go and teach all nations. Okay. We have, with that, reached the burial of Jesus, which is recounted in some detail by Mark. And then we must come to the final chapter. The final chapter, whether we're talking of chapter 28 of Matthew, 24 of Luke, 20 and 21 of John, we have a collection of appearances of the risen Jesus. But what is strange about Mark is that the textual situation is difficult. By that I mean we have a serious problem in that those parchment codices from the 4th century, Sinaiticus and Vaticanus, and other ancient manuscripts, end the Gospel with verse 8. They've gone to the tomb, the women have gone to the tomb, and it is announced to them, do not be alarmed, he is risen, go and tell his disciples. And in verse 8, they went out and fled from the tomb, for terror and amazement had seized them. They said nothing to anyone because they were afraid. Now that is arguably the end of the Gospel of Mark. It's not the end of the other Gospels. They bring in the various appearances of Jesus. But there is an addition to the Gospel of Mark, which is a kind of summary. And that's in our canonical Gospel of Mark, the one that we read in church, chapter 16, 9 to 20, several appearances of the risen Jesus. But we do have a problem in that we have evidence from 2 very significant ancient manuscripts that the Gospel might have ended at verse 8. And what does that say? What does that say? They were so terrified, they went off. Just as the disciples had fled, so the women at the tomb flee. And yet the message gets out there, and people understand it, and people come to believe and to know and love Jesus. So perhaps there's a suggestion there, the way that gospel might have ended. But we need to reflect on that too. To know that the church, despite the failures of human beings, the message of the resurrection was still preached. The church was still founded, and Jesus as the Christ and Son of God, that was understood. And it was understood he came not to be served, but to serve, and to give his life as a ransom for many. Now we've gone from chapter 1 to chapter 16, and I have been using the Gospel Parallels, which is a wonderful book, many, many editions, still available. This uses the text of the New Revised Standard Version, but of course the important thing about Gospel Parallels is that it gives you the Gospel in parallels. And the things that I have been saying about Mark relating to Matthew, relating to Luke, you can find here clearly set out in one page. If you wish to take this study forward, please get hold of Gospel Parallels and gently take a text and just look at what Mark has begun. For Mark set the seeds, which then Matthew and Luke developed. I do hope that these couple of talks will have helped you to appreciate the genius of Mark, the beauty of his portrait of Jesus, which leads to the beauty of not only one gospel, but 2 more synoptics, and of course, the extraordinary Gospel of St. John. Thank you so much for your attention.